President Trump says that trade wars are good and easy to win. A few days ago, on March 2nd, President Trump put out this tweet, as you can see on my screen. He says, and I'm quoting, "When a country, USA, is losing many billions of dollars on trade with virtually every country it does business with, trade wars are good and easy to win. Example, when we are down 100 billion with a certain country and they get cute, don't trade anymore. We win big. It's easy." Do you think he's actually going to follow through with his proposed tariffs on both aluminum and steel of, I believe he's targeting China, Mexico, and Canada the most as of right now. And I believe he wants to put 25% tariffs on one of the metals and 10% tariffs on another. I can't remember the exact details, but it's really unimportant for this video. In your opinion, do you think this is rhetoric from President Trump, or do you think he's actually serious about putting these exact trade tariffs on? Or do you think then that this is a negotiating tactic, you know, art of the deal type of tactic, where he talks an extreme position and he's trying to bring China and Mexico and Canada to the negotiating table to get less? One of the things I would add, though, is that one of the people that Trump brought in to his negotiating team for trade is a guy who has books out, a number of books out, blaming China for all the problems in the U.S. economically. And whereas I think it was corporations who wanted the jobs offshored or outsourced to China, rather than, you know, just blaming China for all the problems. I mean, there really is no free trade, guys, okay? So there's these agreements that claim to be free trade, but there's all these loopholes. The NAFTA agreement, or North American Free Trade Agreement, if it was really free trade, it would have been a very simple agreement. Instead, I interviewed Lou Rockwell a couple years ago about this, and he said NAFTA got passed when he was chief of staff for Ron Paul, and he said he went to go see the NAFTA documentation, and he said it was 10,000 pages. You cannot have free trade with 10,000 pages and all these loopholes and tax breaks and exemptions. So Trump, as of right now, is claiming that maybe some companies will get exemptions. We'll have to see. What do you guys think about this in terms of, is Trump actually going to go through with these trade wars? So I would disagree with Trump that trade wars are good and easy to win. I don't know if Trump is intentionally lying or just saying hyperbole, or this is just crazy rhetoric to lower his negotiating position and get people back to the table to renegotiate maybe some of the bad trade deals, or if he's actually going to go through with some of these things. But the history on trade wars and tariffs, and ultimately all of these policies are based off of mercantilism. So whether you are putting tariffs on imported goods, or you are devaluing your currency to try to gain a trade advantage, or other types of wage and price controls, all of these levers or tactics, even Keynesian economics is basically a derivative or bastardization or derivative of mercantilism. And so if you go to the Foundation for Economic Education website, or FEE website, there's a bunch of articles on trade wars. I'm sure most of the people who write nasty things in the comment section of this video calling me a moron have probably never even read one article on any of these websites about the counter argument. And they'll say, oh, President Trump is going to do a good job with this. Well, in terms of, you know, these tariffs for special interests, so for the steel companies in the United States and for the aluminum companies in the United States, special interest groups, and for some of those workers, this will be beneficial. And the American worker, maybe in some of those cities and states where there is factories that either use those resources or inputs to make value-added things, this may be beneficial. This may mean higher wages or more jobs are kept in the United States. But I think overall, and what most people don't understand, is that the consumer, whether you're in the United States or other countries, the consumer in general is going to be worse off for this. And there's a long documented financial history, and I don't know if Trump knows this or not, or he's ignoring it, or he doesn't know it, or he's just lying. And the history of trade wars is, with tariffs, is very, very clear. And, you know, all these things, like I said, are based on mercantilism. There's tons of articles on the Foundation for Economic Education website. I could literally list you guys dozens of them. The Mises Institute has a bunch of them as well that have come out recently with podcast Trade Barriers as a Cause of War. American Tariffs and Wars from the Revolution to the Depression, that was written a couple of years ago. I'll attach a link to this article in this short little video. I'm just trying to highlight this, that, you know, a lot of people don't think about this. So if you're an American voter, maybe you're a special interest group, overall, for most Americans, these tariffs are not really going to help you too much. You're probably going to be paying more money. Maybe it will bring some jobs back. Maybe it will even help the U.S.'s phony GDP slightly. But this is going to hurt a lot of consumers for prices, whether you're in the United States or elsewhere. And it could potentially lead to retaliation and trade wars. So this is a more recent article by editors of the Mises Wire against Trump's tariffs. I'll attach a link to it. The other thing I wanted to bring up in terms of actual history of trade wars is by one of my favorite people out there, Frederic Bastiat, and this is mentioned in his biography page on Mises. I absolutely love Frederic Bastiat. His writing, it's so clear and coherent, and he writes about, plunder from economic and political elites and cheating the economy and rigging things. And basically I'm going to quote him now. He said the slogan, quote, "If goods don't cross borders, armies will," is often attributed to Bastiat because he so forcefully made the case that free trade was perhaps the surest route to peace as well as prosperity. He understood that throughout history, tariffs had been a major cause of war. Protectionism, after all, is an attempt by governments to inflict on their own citizens in peacetime the same kinds of harm that enemies attempt with naval blockades during wars. Interesting quotes from Bastiat, one of my favorite economic writers. Him and Henry Hazlitt are probably two of the best. They're not big picture thinkers that von Mises and Rothbard were, but they took that more complicated information, and Bastiat was alive before, those others, obviously. Bastiat was an Austrian school economist and free market thinker before there was such a thing as the Austrian school. But and Henry Hazlitt built on Bastiat's work. But they took more complicated economic terms from some of the real heavy hitters and heavy thinkers like Karl Menger and others, and they condensed it down into easier to understand forms. So I think that's where I really love the writings of Bastiat and Henry Hazlitt. So if you're trying to learn more rational, common sense, free market economics, I would start there. I've already talked about economics in one lesson. The other thing is, from a trade perspective, since we do cover markets, and besides, these trade wars, I think these trade wars, the other thing I wanted to bring up in this video is Smoot Hawley. So go and look up the Smoot Hawley Tariff Act, and a lot of people say that not only did Smoot Hawley make the Great Depression of 1929 worse, it also potentially led to war, because it really hurt the economies of both Germany and Japan prior to World War II. And it also hurt the U.S. economy, too, because of, things were subsidized, prices weren't allowed to fall. It was a mess. It made things a mess. There were huge wage and price controls and huge import taxes. Made things a mess made the global economy even worse. A huge mess of things. So in terms of trading ideas, though, I was looking up this. And so if this does actually go through, basically the other thing is Chinese government has been subsidizing enormous amounts of overproduction for aluminum and steel and iron ore and other base metals and copper, of course. And so basically, this is not free market demand. This is enormous central planning, and just to keep a bunch of workers with high-paying wages and jobs there so they don't go on strike and don't demand political revolution. And one of these entities that is drastically oversubsidized and has tried to flood the global economy with artificially cheap, way too much supply of aluminum is Aluminum Core of China. It's an AGR, and its symbol ACH on the New York Stock Exchange. That's Alfred Charlie Harriet. So this is something to take a look at. And if these tariffs do pass, this is going to potentially hurt a company like Aluminum Core of China. And, if you go back and look through the stock, initially, like before the 2008 financial crisis, this was like a $40 stock, and it's gone down a lot. It's bounced around support levels. It got as high as, in summer of 2017, it got as high as $22 a share again and started to head downwards into a downtrend. But if, these tariffs are real, it could potentially do a lot more damage than that. So you could see a lot below $14 a share. But the thing is, with a state-owned enterprise in China that's somewhat backed by the Chinese government, you could see intervention by the Chinese government of either taking the shares before the stock totally collapses and goes much lower. You could see games played like that. So if you are going to, and you're a more aggressive trader, you're sophisticated, and you are going to think about potentially maybe buying out of the money puts if this Trump tariff on aluminum does go through, maybe only bet for 20 or 30%, at most maybe 40%, because there could be games played, like I said, by the Chinese government and the state-owned enterprise by cheating with the stock. You could have it just removed. You could have a private equity firm in China buy up the shares at a premium when it looks like the stock's about to totally crash. There's games that could be played. But so you know, this is just a new normal we're in now, where people can cheat any market forces where if a tariff's going to be set up. So bottom line, guys, is for this tweet, if Trump is really serious about this and that trade wars are good and easy to win, I completely and totally disagree with him. He is either lying, he's lazy, or he has not studied financial history. One of the worst examples of trade wars and tariffs in American history, and there's a lot of examples of this, if you go back and actually read articles on the Mises Institute website or on the Foundation for Economic Education, and you just type in trade wars and search and spend about an hour reading some of the articles, one of the worst examples is Smoot Hawley. And so no mention of this, but you know, as a politician, President Trump the politician, this may help him get reelected. So in the short term, this may help him with special interest groups and temporarily help certain companies associated either directly producing steel or iron ore or in the value-added supply chain, that they can raise prices and their workers are going to keep their jobs and maintain wages. But overall, I would say that this is not going to help every single American. In fact, it's going to raise prices across the board, and it's definitely not going to help the global economy. But I've said this for a long time now, and this is where everyone, in my opinion, where all the global economy is headed, is to higher inflation, higher taxes, and trade wars with tariffs. So I've been saying this for well over a year now, that pretty much all the global economies, maybe they let the asset prices temporarily crash for 6 to 12 months to scare people. Then they're going to intervene and do more central planning. The QEs in some form, covert or overt, it's going to increase. There's going to be more inflation and taxes, more stagflation, misallocation of capital. We're already in the tens of trillions. And then on top of this, there's most likely, and we saw this from the 1920s, and this is why I've been saying for a while now that it looks like things are like around 1927. There's a lot of examples I can name why I think right now is similar to 1927. And one of those is that Smoot Hawley was implemented not too long after that. So you're starting to see countries, because the global economic pie, everyone's claiming their GDP is doing good, but the real global economic pie is not growing. Okay, the real global economic pie, when you subtract a real inflation rate, when you take a look at what's really going on beneath the surface of phony government economic statistics, the real global economic pie is actually shrinking and the debt levels are growing. So that means that all these economies, whether it's China, Germany, different parts of Europe, Japan, the United States, are all fighting for a global economic pie that they claim is rising, but is really in real terms shrinking. So when you have people fighting over larger and larger slices of a pie that is shrinking, they will start to cheat and use things like trade wars, wage and price controls, tariffs, these things. And that ultimately could potentially lead sometime down the line, potentially to a real war. So we'll have to see how serious President Trump is. But, this is a very interesting tweet he's given out. I obviously don't agree with it. But there's going to be a lot of Americans out there who don't understand economics, who think that, yeah, President Trump's doing a great job to try to protect Americans and save the U.S. economy, and I'm going to vote for him again, and this is why he's going to win re-election. So this could be his motives behind this. We'll have to see. There's been other great investors like hedge fund manager Mark Yusko that have compared President Trump to Herbert Hoover. And I believe Herbert Hoover was one of the, I'm not sure if he was president yet, but he was definitely Secretary of Commerce back then. And so President Hoover was involved in the Smoot Hawley. Either he was president or he was Secretary of Commerce. I can't really remember. But he was directly involved in implementing Smoot Hawley along with the Congress at that time. And they thought they were doing a good job. They thought they were protecting American workers and American consumers, and it backfired and made things a lot worse. A lot of libertarian and Austrian school financial and economic historians believe that Smoot Hawley was one of the main causes of that led to World War II. And definitely made the economy worse and prolonged the Great Depression. Okay, guys, well, that's it for this short little video. Very interesting times we live in, don't you think, where we have a president going out and saying these things about trade wars. Very, very interesting times indeed.